Welcome back. Same me, same day, same cup of coffee. We are just trying to get a bunch of these filmed. So we'll see what happens. You might get bored of looking at me wearing the same thing, but such is life. We are now going to be talking about mental health services, legal and ethical issues. And this is chapter 16. And you might be thinking, okay, wait a second, Carrie. We were just doing chapter 4. Why are we jumping to chapter 16? Excellent question. The reason being that some of the things that we talk about in chapter 16 are relevant for next week's discussion about ethics. And so I thought, let's do chapter 16 first, and then we get into ethics, which of course isn't in the textbook. You'll really, really love me when I tell you what you have to read for that at the end of this lecture. I probably shouldn't have told you that. Oh well, happens. So I want us to have a brief introduction to this, and again, we're going to be doing this fairly briefly. So one of the things you're going to notice, and again, I probably mentioned this during our first class meeting, but just in case I didn't, I'll say it again now. You will find that we don't always cover every chapter in its entirety. And so again, if you look at your course outline on the lecture schedule, which I just happen to have here, for some chapters, so for example, for eating disorders and for suicide and for PTSD, it specifically gives you page numbers because those are only a fraction of the chapter. So for some reason, this fine, lovely book, see, look at how prepared I was, guys. I even had the textbook with me. Eating disorders are in the same chapter as sleep disorders, which we're not talking about. So I don't need you to read about sleep disorders. For a chapter like chapter 16, I'm still expecting you to have read the whole chapter, even though I will only be highlighting certain parts in this lecture. Because again, the whole point of having these video lectures ahead of in-class discussion is so that we can have a more fulsome discussion in class. Really helps when you've read the text before the in-class discussion. I did hear from a former student over the summer that she never read the textbook in any of my classes. Don't be that person. Don't do that. Especially this term. I know it's harder because we're not in the classroom together, because you're at home or wherever it is that you are. But please try to keep up with the readings because again, we will only have that hour of discussion and I want us to be able to get the most out of it. That's why I'm here in August doing this, okay? So back to our actual topic, mental health services, legal and ethical issues. What we're going to start by talking about are two different types of commitment. And I'm not talking about like, let's get married commitment. I'm talking about when we put people into a facility against their will commitment. And it's either a mental health hospital or a forensic unit, like a forensic psych center, or a jail. Okay, civil commitment. In order for a person to be civilly committed, we have certain criteria. These are not the criteria, just by the way. These are links that you're going to go to in a minute to read about someone in Canada who was civilly committed. But the essential criteria for civil commitment is that the person has a mental illness. That's number one. We don't lock people up against their will if they have, and again, this is not having committed a crime. Okay, we'll talk about criminal commitment next. That's when the person has actually committed a crime. Civil commitment is when we say to someone, essentially, due to your mental illness and your lack of engagement in treatment, you are a danger to other people or yourself. And in order to protect you and protect other people, we are going to confine you against your will. Okay, this is court ordered. The person cannot just walk out. So I'm sort of going all over the place. I would be doing that in class too, don't worry. This is what happens. We go on a little like wandering, meandering walk through the forest. If I felt like I was gonna be a threat to someone, right? Like Caleb doesn't know, and he's kind of smart because he had me move my bags. They were right over here. He had me move them to the other side of the room. So I can't just whip out a machete and start attacking him, right? Smart guy. Plus, how would we maintain our 6 feet of distance? I don't have that long a knife. But so if I felt like I was a danger to myself or to other people, I had these uncontrollable urges to stab people. I feel like that's where I would go, like just stabby, right? Like I'm not into guns, just a little stabby. I could go to the hospital. I could get myself to Rocky View or to Foothills or Peter Lougheed if I felt like venturing far north, and say, I am afraid I'm going to hurt someone. I have these uncontrollable urges to stab. I had to have my husband take away all the sharp knives in our house. I think I'm in trouble. And they would say, yeah, you are. You've come to the right place, my dear. And they would start assessing me, and they would probably restrain me and or medicate me. If I am checking myself into the hospital, guess what? Later that night, after I've had a good long rest, no child waking me up in the middle of the night, no husband elbowing me, right? Like I could be like, yeah, you know what, I'm feeling much better. I think I'm going to go now. And they'd have to let me go if I was no longer a threat. If I was like, no, I'm not going to stab anyone, I promise. No, I'll come back for my follow-up appointment. If I check myself into the hospital, I can check myself out unless they have determined that I need to be held against my will, okay? In the case of civil commitment and in the case of criminal commitment, that is not the case. You can't just walk out. You can't sign yourself out. You are court-ordered to be there. So again, in civil commitment, 3 criteria have to be met. The first is that the person has to have a mental illness. The second is that the person is dangerous to themselves or to other people. And the third is that the person needs treatment. So in the example I just gave you using myself, I don't meet that criteria, right? So I'm feeling stabby, but I don't have a mental illness, or at least not one I'm going to disclose to you on camera. And I also don't really need treatment for my stabbiness, right? What I really need is like to sleep and not want to kill people. So I'd be able to walk out. But if a person who was feeling similarly stabby had a mental health diagnosis, they have bipolar disorder, they are depressed, they have anxiety, but like clinically significant, and they are not currently receiving treatment, and doctors feel that with treatment they would no longer be a danger to themselves or others, then they can be court-ordered to remain in a facility and receive the treatment. And there's a little caveat to that, which is that when you are in a facility, even though you are there for treatment purposes, you have the right to refuse treatment. And that's something that comes up in these links that you guys have on your PowerPoints. In just a second, I'm going to tell you to hit pause on me and go over and read about Professor Starson. He was making that choice that he didn't want treatment, but the thing is, he can make that choice, but he then can't choose the consequence. In his case, the consequence was remaining committed. So if he had agreed to treatment, and if he had agreed to then maintain his treatment once he was released from the hospital, he could have not been confined. But he maintained that he did not need treatment, and he was going to refuse medication and refuse to participate in therapy. Therefore, the consequence was he remained civilly committed. So the reason I've chosen Professor Starson, it's actually a bit of a complicated case. It's a little bit all over the place. But the reason that I've chosen it is because it is a Canadian context. So often we find, particularly in abnormal psychology, a lot of like the great cases are all in the US, and we think, well, that wouldn't happen here. Yeah, no, it did. This did happen here, okay? So go ahead and hit, well, just before you hit pause, there's 2 links. One is Globe and Mail, one is National Post. Read them both, and then when your curiosity is piqued, feel free to just Google him, and you'll be able to read much more about him. After you've gotten your fill of Professor Starson, come on back, and we'll talk about some more features related to civil commitment. Okay. So you've had your fill of Professor Starson, and I'm sure we will be talking about him in our discussion later on this week. So the other things that we think about, and again, as a reminder again for the slides, I tend to stick with the headings that are in your textbook, even if they don't always fully make sense, and that's so that you can follow along if you're following along with your text. I like to dream. I've been doing this long enough that I know you're not. but I like to pretend that you are, so I try to facilitate the process. Okay? So the next thing we have to think about is how we define mental illness. And you might be thinking, well, the DSM-5 defines mental illness. It lays out pretty clear criteria that outline what a disorder is. By the way, I had the realization last night, like, oh, I should have my DSM with me when I'm doing this. But then I remembered that my DSM's in my office, and I only filled out a form allowing myself to be in T115, not to allow myself to go to my office in EA, so I don't have the DSM with me. I have the textbook because I had a copy of that at home, but I do not have the DSM with me here today to use as a prop because that's over in EA, and I wasn't going into 2 buildings. That was too much to handle for one day, okay? So again, you might be thinking, well, we define mental illness, we open up the DSM, we think someone has anxiety, we go to the anxiety section, we look through the criteria for the different disorders, and boom, they either have anxiety or they don't. And from a clinical perspective, you're kind of right. But again, we're now in a legal perspective. From a legal perspective, each province has their own definition of mental illness. So that's something that's important for us to keep in mind, is that we are, we're currently in Alberta. Some of you are going to become registered as psychologists or counselors or social workers in Alberta, and you will need to know what Alberta determines is mental illness. But if you then move to BC, because who doesn't want even more forest fire smoke, or you move to Quebec because you can't get enough of ridiculous politics that you feel like you want to undertake that, or you decide, I want to go to the nicest places in Canada, and you move out to the Maritimes. I've never been to the Maritimes. I think the Rockies are spectacular. I moved here from East Coast, from Quebec actually, but I also think, I don't know, ocean, Halifax, chill, laid back lifestyle might be nice. You would need to learn whatever the province you're living in, how they define mental illness from a legal perspective. So remember that a legal perspective and a clinical perspective are different. When people come to see me for therapy, or when they did when I was in private practice, it didn't matter whether they met the legal definition of mental illness. They wanted help, they wanted support. But the reason the legal definition matters is if somebody doesn't meet the criteria for a mental illness from a legal perspective, we can't civilly commit them. They also then can't use mental illness potentially as their defense for having committed a crime, which is what we'll get to next with criminal commitment and the not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect plea. So remember that the legal system and the mental health system are 2 different systems. But a mental illness can be something that is used within the legal system, oftentimes for alternative incarceration, in the sense of being in a mental institution as opposed to a prison. Okay, so it's a little bit, and we can talk more about this in discussion if it comes up, but that's just important to know that each province will set its own definition of what is their legal threshold for mental illness. There was actually just a pretty controversial case that wrapped up, I can't remember if it wrapped up earlier in 2020 or in 2019. Time is kind of this mystical concept these days because but it was actually a former MRU student who, while high on mushrooms, broke into someone's house naked. And it actually ended up being a faculty member at MRU. The 2 did not know each other. Like, that was unrelated, but was just coincidental. And so the issue was, usually when someone commits a crime when they are intoxicated, whether it's alcohol or drugs, that would not count as mental illness because they willfully took the alcohol or drugs and then committed whatever criminal activity. So they're deemed to still be responsible for their behavior. In this particular case, the drug use was actually seen as having caused, he had never, if I'm remembering correctly, and I might not be, but you can certainly Google this to get the details, he hadn't used hallucinogens before and so didn't know how he'd react. And so this reaction of going in the middle of the winter naked and breaking into someone's house was not an expected outcome from this drug use. And so that was a factor in his criminal case, okay? But so that's, again, where knowing how a province defines it and how they look at it makes a difference. They had to make a special application to consider his drug use as a mental illness factor because it was such a surprising response. So the lesson here is don't do mushrooms or other hallucinogens. Stick to something that you trust. I mean, no, I didn't. I just did say that on camera, didn't I? See, usually I say stuff like that in class and nobody's recording and I don't have to worry about it as much. Now I'm being recorded and maybe we'll do a little fancy editing. Maybe we won't. We'll see how that goes. Okay, we're going to move on, which actually is kind of funny because we're going to move on to dangerousness, and I feel like I'm heading into dangerousness here with how I'm doing this a little fast and loose. Here's the thing about psychologists and their ability to predict dangerousness. We suck. Plain and simple. That's just really, we're terrible at predicting dangerousness. There are researchers, there are clinicians who have spent their careers trying to come up with better ways to predict dangerousness. And the truth of the matter is, we just don't know. We can look at risk factors, and oftentimes what we look at is a person's previous behavior. Well, that means they were already dangerous for us to be considering them dangerous. It's one of the reasons why dangerous offender hearings, which are something that again happen in the legal system, are so tricky because we really have a hard time knowing who is going to reoffend and if they will reoffend in a dangerous way. So we're not so good at that, and it's just something that we have to think about because again, one of the criteria for civil commitment is that the person has to be a danger to themselves or others. How do we determine that? That's the hard part. So we look at factors like previous behavior. We look at their life at previous traumas. We look at substance use. We look at anger and reactivity. But at the end of the day, we often don't know who's going to snap in a violent and dangerous way. And as we get into the slides on civil commitment and a couple of the stories that I'm going to link you to, we'll see that in several of those cases, we could have never predicted the outcome, and they were pretty awful outcomes. Okay. Last thing to think about a little bit for civil commitment is the concept of deinstitutionalization and the resulting homelessness and how that plays into people ending up being civilly committed. So prior to the 1960s, we didn't have great treatment for schizophrenia. And so a lot of people who experience schizophrenia, particularly with hallucinations and delusions and sometimes getting dangerous, and I want to just say the vast majority of people who commit violent crimes do not have mental health issues. The vast majority of people who have psychotic illnesses do not commit violent crimes. The ones that do become sensationalized because it's a good story, it sells newspapers, it draws people in to watch TV. But keep in mind that the vast majority of people with mental illness are actually less likely to be violent than members of the general population, okay? But because we didn't have good treatment, particularly didn't have good medication, people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders were institutionalized. They were kept in hospitals long term. It was viewed as safer for them, safer for people around them. Then along came the antipsychotic medications. And they were pretty good at controlling hallucinations and delusions. They have a host of side effects. They do nothing for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, so all of the lack symptoms, so the lack of speech, the poverty of thought, the lack of ability to take care of activities of daily living, basic hygiene. The meds don't touch that, but they do reduce the hallucinations and delusions. And so there's this widespread thought of, well, if people aren't having active hallucinations and delusions anymore, we don't need to keep them in hospitals because they're not a danger to anybody. They're not a threat. They're not seeing things, hearing things, believing things that aren't true. And so lo and behold, across the world, but especially in North America, all of these institutions, these asylums, these psychiatric hospitals, shuttered. Beds were gone. What we learned after that happened was that these medications had side effects, people stopped taking them, all the symptoms came back, and now there was nowhere for people to go because the hospitals were gone, the beds were gone. There was a thought that people could stay in the community, and a lot of people have done what's known as a downward drift, where they end up homeless, because if you're actively having hallucinations and delusions, it's really hard to have a job. It's hard to be reliable and show up to work. If you don't have a job and a source of income, you can't pay rent, so you get evicted from your apartment. Where do you go then? So we have this problem now where, because we don't have adequate treatment available in treatment facilities, we have a number of people who are living on the streets or without secure housing because what they actually need is treatment. And what ends up happening is, if somebody is actively hallucinating, they may in fact do something that can be perceived as dangerous by other people, and then they end up in a case of civil commitment because they have a mental health disorder, they're a danger to themselves or others, and they need treatment. And we get back to the top. See, so that's how that little circle worked. Okay. So now we move on to criminal commitment. Now, again, you will see on your slides, don't go there just yet. I'll tell you when to pause. I'll tell you when I'm going to stop for a sec. And criminal commitment is for when a person has committed a criminal act. Okay, period. So we're not defining, it could be any myriad of criminal acts. It could be setting a house on fire, it could be killing people, it could be sexual assault, it could be kidnapping, it could be robbery, it could be anything. But they've committed a criminal activity, and what they're saying, or what their lawyer is saying, is they are not criminally responsible for their behavior because of a mental disorder or defect. And so what they're basically saying is, at the time that they committed the crime, they were not of their right state of mind, that their mental illness, their mental disorder or defect, that's the terminology we use in the Canadian legal system, had incapacitated their ability to know the difference between right and wrong and to be responsible for their behavior. This is what in the US is often referred to as the insanity defense, right? There is no insanity defense in Canada, and in fact in the States, it's not guilty by reason of insanity, so NGRI. In Canada, it's NCRMD, not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder or defect. Okay. Again, also keep in mind the term insanity is a legal term. It is not a psychological term. You will not find the word insanity anywhere in the DSM. That is strictly a legal term that's used for this idea of this legal defense, the insanity defense. So the examples that we have here, I have 3 different, again, all Canadian, unfortunately, all Canadian cases of people who have tried to use, and with varying levels of success, the insanity defense and have been found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect. The first 2 articles, and again, one is National Post, one is Calgary Sun. Some of these papers, by the way, will have paywalls essentially. You're allowed to read 10 articles for free, and then they want you to sign up and subscribe. Use a different device or just clear your cookies and you should be good to be able, I didn't just say that, did I, on video? Oopsies. But anyway, if you're struggling to gain access, let me know and I can always save a file as a PDF and send it to you, okay? But the first 2 have to do with a gentleman named Vince Lee. He has since changed his name to Will Baker. And if you're thinking, Vince Lee, that might sound a little bit familiar. He's also known as the Greyhound bus beheader. He's the guy, Caleb did not know we were going there today. This was several years ago. Vince Lee was on a bus across the Canadian prairie, which can make anybody go a little bit out of their mind. He was actively experiencing hallucinations and delusions. He had never been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He had never had a psychotic episode before. And he believed that if he did not kill the person sitting next to him, the person sitting next to him was going to kill him. That's what the voices were telling him. And he had a sword, and he beheaded Tim McLean, who was sitting next to him. And he also then started cannibalizing him. That's the other part of the story. This all happened outside, I believe it happened outside of Portage la Prairie, which if you've ever driven across Manitoba, you can see that happen. By that point, you're like a little stir crazy. And so what ended up happening, and so again, you'll read these 2 stories, they give a bit of the backstory and then a bit of what was happening. He was correctly found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect. He has responded really well to treatment, and over the years he has been given increasing freedoms to leave. So he was being held at the Selkirk Institute, which is in Selkirk, Manitoba. It's a forensic hospital. So it means that, at the beginning he was on very much a locked psychiatric floor with very few privileges, and as he progressed in treatment, he has gained increasing privileges. So first it was walking the grounds with a staff member, then it was walking the grounds by himself, then it was going into town with a staff member, going into town by himself, being able to stay out overnight. He is someone, once someone has been found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect, they are sent for treatment. Once they have been restored to competence, so to speak, or once they have received treatment, there is no reason to hold them. And a lot of people struggle with that because they say, but wait, they killed someone or they severely hurt someone. Why aren't they in jail for the rest of their life? Because they didn't know what they were doing when they killed the person. They were not in their right frame of mind. And so we're looking at a treatment pathway as opposed to an incarceration pathway, the hope being that as they respond to treatment, they become more aware, they recognize the importance of remaining in treatment and all these good things, and eventually they can reintegrate into society. Second case, the next two links are both Huffington Post links. One of them is actually just a collection of other links, all having to do with Guy Turcotte. Guy Turcotte was a cardiologist in Quebec, just outside of Montreal. He and his wife had recently separated. They had 2 young children, and he found out his wife was having an affair with their personal trainer. If you're looking for high-level, soap opera-level drama, we've got it happening here. Guy Turcotte became so distraught and so despondent that he was going to kill himself because he just couldn't live with what was going on. But he happened to have his children that night, so he killed them first so that they wouldn't wake up and find their dad dead, and then he unsuccessfully attempted suicide. So his 2 kids are now dead, he has killed them, and he tried to kill himself but didn't succeed. Now, there are a couple of holes in this. Number one being he's a cardiologist, he's a doctor. He should know on some level what will and won't kill him, I would think. He was drinking antifreeze, that was his thing. When the police showed up at his house, they found him under his bed, ill but still alive, and the 2 kids dead. So his case was a lot of drama because at his first trial, he was found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect because he was in such a profound depression about the breakup of his marriage. He wasn't in his right mind. But then he was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Quebec, I think actually in Montreal, and he was released soon thereafter because lo and behold, once his depression was treated, he was fine. People had a problem with that. He was retried and he was actually found guilty on the second trial, and he's currently in jail. The last case is unfortunately a close to home case. Many of you are probably aware of the Bermuda Shorts party at the University of Calgary that went horribly wrong several years ago when Matthew DeGrood, who was also in the throes of a psychotic episode without ever having had a diagnosis before, never had a psychotic episode before, murdered 5 other students. This one's tougher, right? Because this one is like here. So we're talking Manitoba, we're talking Quebec, we're talking older people. Now we're talking about someone who could be one of you sitting wherever you're sitting, because you're not sitting here in front of me. But usually you'd be sitting here in front of me when I'm talking about this. And he too was found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder or defect. He was sent to the Southern Alberta Forensic Institute, and then he was actually transferred up to Edmonton. And there have been some real issues coming up as a result of this because, again, he has responded well to treatment. He has been given increasing freedoms. And the families of the people he murdered are very opposed to this because, of course, their loved ones are gone and they want punishment. But he's actually doing, like the system is working in a way in that he is doing much better, and as of last year had been given permission to travel for as long as a week away from hospital, as long as he stayed in Alberta and was with an adult. So there's some stuff there. Okay, definitely some stuff there. And I think, I do have a reflection question there. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to the reflection question because it's directly related to these, and then we'll come back to fitness to stand trial. This is the type of thing I would do in class too. Rather than make 2 slides, I would just go forward, go backward, make you a little crazy. So assuming that at this point you have paused me at some point and read all the links, if you haven't, pause, go back and read the links on the previous slide. And in thinking about both Vince Lee, and now his current name is Will Baker, he was allowed to change his name, and Matthew DeGrood cases, are there increased freedoms just? Why or why not? Yeah, it's another thinky question, right? I do that. I make you think. I also realize this says reflection question 3, and you might be thinking this is the first one in this video, Carrie, and that's because I had chapters 4 and 6 as one set of slide presentations, but we have broken the videos up. So this is, in fact, in case you're confused on your counting, this is the first reflection question for this section, okay? Even though it says question 3. But it's because they're due on the same week. So this is the third question from the questions that are due for the week of September 15th, or for class on September 15th, I should say. Okay, so you've had a chance, you've paused, you've unpaused, let's go back. We'll talk about fitness to stand trial. So another issue that comes up within the criminal justice system and mental illness is that when somebody is not in their right state of mind when they are arrested, what do we do? Well, we have to figure out, have they been in that state of mind since before they committed the crime? So did they commit the crime and they would be found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder or defect? But we can't get to that stage until they can actually stand trial, okay? And in order to stand trial, a person has to be able to assist in their defense, to understand their role in the proceedings, and to understand the nature or the object of the proceedings. So again, there's 3 things that need to happen. When a person is charged with a crime, and we're going to take them to trial to determine whether they in fact committed the crime or not, if they are fit to stand trial, they are able to assist in their defense, they understand their role in the proceedings, and they understand the nature or the object of the proceedings. If the answers to those questions are no, they are not fit to stand trial. And so what happens at that stage is they would be sent to a psychiatric unit where they would be given treatment, and after some time, they would be reassessed for fitness to stand trial. And so in the cases of both Vince Lee and Matthew DeGrood, that's exactly what happened. At the time that they were arrested for their crimes, they were not in a state of mind where they could be fit to stand trial. They were each sent to a psychiatric institution, given treatment, and then once their psychotic episodes were over and they understood what was going on, they were then deemed fit to stand trial, and then they proceeded with that not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder or defect. Okay? So again, 2 separate things that can be related. In this case, where again, I have a link to a story in the Calgary Herald, this is a case of a gentleman who was not deemed fit to stand trial. So this one is always a little bit tricky for me to talk about because I actually know the people in question. So this is the case of Fred and Audrey Van Zweden. Fred and Audrey were a lovely couple. Fred had lived in Holland and was lived there during the Second World War. He was Jewish. And so he used to speak here at Mount Royal as part of the Holocaust Education Symposium that happens every year. Some of you, if you went to high school in Calgary, may have participated, and some of you may have even heard Fred, although at this point, no, none of you would have heard Fred speak, I don't think, unless you're returning to school as a more mature student. Let's put it that way, because Fred stopped speaking several years ago. So Fred and Audrey were just lovely, and they were like so total opposites. Fred was this big, tall, strapping guy. He actually used to build sailboats. That was part of what he did for work. And Audrey was this tiny, petite, lovely woman. I knew them through my work with the symposium, and I remember bumping into them at Theatre Calgary once, and Fred was all excited because he thought I was Dutch as well, because it was a play having to do with the Netherlands. And I was like, no, I'm just like the theater. Lovely, lovely, lovely people. And Fred killed Audrey in their apartment one night. Fred, as I said, had Alzheimer's. He most likely thought that Audrey was someone who was against him. He was having a lot of flashbacks to the war and to his time during the Holocaust. And he ended up killing her. He was a much larger man. I don't know the details, so don't ask. That shouldn't come up in discussion because I don't know details. But he killed her. And when he was brought into court, he was asked if he knew why he was there. And he said, they tell me that I killed my wife, but I've never killed anybody. I've never hurt anybody. While he was being housed at the Southern Alberta Forensic Institute to determine fitness to stand trial, he thought the guards were Nazis. He thought he was back in the war. And ultimately, the doctors and the prosecution agreed that he was not able to stand trial because he was too far gone in Alzheimer's to be able to know what was happening. He did not know what he had done. So in a case like that, where you're found unfit to stand trial, you then remain in hospital essentially until such a time as you are fit. And in a case like that, with a degenerative neurological disorder, he was never going to become fit. So they were working. He has since passed away. He passed away with pneumonia a couple of years ago. They had been in the process of trying to get him moved into a seniors facility that was secure, just so that he wouldn't have to be in a psychiatric hospital, but more of like a nursing home that had a secure unit. But he passed away before that happened. So that's fitness to stand trial. So go ahead and you can read that link and get a little more information about that. And then you're going to come back and we're going to last talk about duty to warn. So we're going to talk about duty to warn. Duty to warn is an obligation of psychologists, counselors, social workers, where if we are made aware that a client is making a threat against another person and we believe the threat to be credible and we know we can identify who the intended target is, we are to break confidentiality to warn that person. And that all came about as a result of what's just talked about as the Tarasov case. And as you click this link, that'll take you over to some information about the Tarasov case. The basic gist of it is that Tatiana Tarasov was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. There was another student, Prasenjit Podar, who was interested in her romantically. She wasn't so interested. He told his therapist that he was going to hurt her. The therapist properly broke confidentiality and notified campus police, who then went and spoke to him and said, listen, buddy, there's other fish in the sea. You're going to meet someone else. Promise us you'll leave this girl alone. He said, yes, 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 you're right. And then he went and shot her. So what has evolved since then is that psychologists now have a duty to warn the intended victim. It's not enough to just notify police that the person may be a threat. But in this case, because he had identified Tarasov as his victim, now, today, in a similar situation, the therapist would be obligated to try to get in touch with her to let her know that this threat was imminent. Okay, so that's just another piece that we have to think about. Okay, last little bit of this lecture. So we already did the reflection question, so I'm going to scooch ahead to ethics and treatment of mental illness. Ultimately, 3 things we have to think about as therapists: boundary issues, okay? We have to be really careful, particularly with dual roles. That's something that sometimes can come up. If you're someone's therapist, you also can't be their relative, you can't be their teacher, you can't be their little league coach, things like that, right? We want to be careful that we only have the role of therapist with someone. We also want to make sure we're not doing business with people who are our therapy clients. And most importantly, we shouldn't be having sex with them either. Okay, that's another one. It's pretty clear, and this sort of gets us into the APA and CPA codes that we'll talk about next week, but that's that's a boundary issue, right? You should not be sleeping with your therapy clients. Shouldn't even be kissing them, Okay, we shouldn't be kissing anybody these days unless they're in your bubble, right? So there's that too. Do no harm, I think, should be pretty self-explanatory. So again, as we think about some historical examples, like the first guy who did like a cingulotomy, who like took an ice pick and shoved it up someone's nose into their brain, that would probably fall under harm, and we shouldn't be doing that, okay? So we want to really think about what we're doing. We do things that can be viewed as harmful. So like I said, electroconvulsive shock therapy is still used, but it's used when all other treatments failed, and it's recommended. It's never first-line treatment. So please don't worry that you're going to go to a therapist and they're going to say, all right, we're going to strap you down and slap on some electrodes and jolt you. It's a last resort, not a first option. And then also recognizing your limits of competence. And this one can be a little trickier, especially for newer therapists who just want to do it all. But there are going to be things you're good at, and there are going to be things that you're not so good at. I realized relatively early in my career that there were certain types of disorders that I was not a very effective therapist for. So if somebody calls me and in our initial phone call they disclose that that's what they're looking for treatment for, I refer them to someone else, because that wouldn't be good. Similarly, there are specialties within psychology. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about forensics today with all the legal components. I am not a forensic psychologist. I would not be comfortable taking on the role of doing a forensic assessment because that's not my training. So that's what we mean about the limits of competence, right? You want to do what you're trained to do and not try to do more. In terms of the rights that patients have, they have the right to treatment. They also have the right to refuse treatment. So I talked about that earlier when I talked about Professor Starson and said he could refuse treatment, but he couldn't choose what the consequence of that refusal was. The consequence of that refusal for him was staying institutionalized. He doesn't get to choose that, but he can refuse treatment. And then, of course, the rights of research participants, which all of you should be familiar with because you all likely participated in research when you were in 1103, 1104, 1105. Some of you are doing research as honor students or for directed readings or as research assistants. So research participants, and this again ties into what we're going to talk about next week. They have the right to withdraw without any penalty. They have the right to be informed of what the research is about and what will be expected of them, right? They have the right to have the benefits outweigh the risks. Last little thing to think about, just in terms of clinical practice guidelines, are these concepts of clinical utility and clinical efficacy, and this kind of takes us full circle back to when we were talking about the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. When we're talking about the utility of something in clinical practice, we're talking about whether it works in the real world, kind of related to external validity, whether it has real world application. When we're talking about clinical efficacy, we're talking more from a research perspective. And so, again, a little bit closer to internal validity. So thinking a little bit about what we're doing in our clinical practice and whether we're doing something because we know that it is clinically effective, it has clinical efficacy, but we may have to modify it for it to actually be useful, to have utility. And that wraps up chapter 16.